Is there a crisis in narrative therapy? Has storytelling become story selling? Is there an inflation of narrative? Are we in a post-narrative time? Well, in the recent release, The Crisis of Narration by contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Han, he says that there is a crisis in narration. In this new thesis, he explores some important developments in a world that is in need of new narrative forms that should concern therapists that are interested in how folks narrate themselves. Now, before I survey this new work, I'm going to do it, of which I'm going to do a series of videos. I think it's important to say that most of the literature that has contributed to what is known as narrative therapy was produced before there was widespread use of the internet, let alone massive expansion of the smartphone and all its associated social media apps. This is important to note because in The Crisis of Narration, Han explores the breakdown of narrative in the contemporary digital age, something lacking in the literature around narrative therapy theory and practice, in my opinion. So I've decided I'm going to do a multi-part series of videos on The Crisis of Narration, breaking down its main points, examining the problem as conceptualized by Han, and then hopefully offering some suggestions for the narrative-inclined therapist to consider while working in this new environment. For those that might not be familiar with Byung-Chul Han, he's a South Korean-born philosopher, cultural theorist living in Germany. He was a professor at the Berlin University of the Arts and still occasionally gives courses there. This is his second book I have read, the first being The Burnout Society, which I found compelling as well, and I recommend reading. So let's start with some opening points or the developing problems with narration as he sees it. First, when Living was narrating, there was never any talk of storytelling or narration. In other words, everyone is talking about narratives, which equals an inflation of narrative, which equals a crisis in narration. Han argues that the inflation in concepts such as the narrative turn and storytelling have caused narrative to lose their original power, their secret magic. Han believes that once narratives are seen as something that is constructed, they lose their moment of inner truth, that our narratives then become contingent, exchangeable, and modifiable. Okay, time for a sidebar here. This is where the post-structuralists and social constructionists like me start to go, huh? Of course narrative is contingent, exchangeable, modifiable. But let's hear him out. He continues his argument by writing that a world-changing and a world-opening narrative cannot be created on a whim of a single person. Rather, such binding narratives are a complex process that are the opposite of exchangeable and contingent narratives. Here he is critiquing micro-narratives that he believes lack gravity or moments of truth. In my translation, Han is arguing for a return of some version of meta-narrating. I know, those of us with the postmodern sensibility might be wondering why Han is arguing for a return of meta-narratives. Haven't we already done away with such nonsense? Well, let's hear him out. These are challenging times. New forms are needed. What does he have to say? Point 2, narration is a concluding form. Han contends that narrative is a concluding form that creates a closed order that founds meaning and identity. What is a closed order? Well, my translation is closed order equals truth. And he's careful in the language that he uses. That's my translation. Let's go with it. Han believes that the late modernity, or I would say the postmodern turn, was characterized by an opening up or unbounding of narrative which eroded truth claims or narrative forms of closure. Han believes that because of this narrative permissiveness that lacked meaning and identity, a narrative vacuum was established that has since been filled by populist, nationalist, right-wing extremists, and conspiracy theories because they are happy to offer up closed order or truth. Han believes the post-narrative era is one of ever-increasing contingency, which makes folks susceptible to offers of narrative closure or truth by bad actors. Point 3, through storytelling, capitalism appropriates the narrative and submits it to consumption. Han believes storytelling has become story selling. Han writes that narratives create community, but storytelling only creates fleeting community and a commodified form of community at that. This is where Han begins to take on the damage he believes digital screens have caused to narrative. Han believes digital screens have separated people into individuals and lonely consumers unable to form real community, and that no amount of stories on social media can fill the narrative vacuum. Han believes that all posting, liking, and sharing content are just forms of pornographic self-presentation and self-promotion that are just intensifying the narrative crisis. Interesting point. Thanks for watching my pornographic self-presentation video. Point 4, narration and information are counteracting forces. Han believes that amid the tsunami of information that the digital age has wrought, there is an increasing need for meaning, identity, and orientation. Han believes that all information we are subjected to intensifies the experience of contingency or uncertainty, and what we ultimately seek is a narrative anchor. Which rings true to me for the 4 of you who happen to read the article I co-authored with Beth Patrick and Jay D'Arrigo titled Colliding Discourses, Families Negotiating Religion, Sexuality, and Identity, which was published in a Springer Brief. In that article, I detail how naming of an anchoring metaphor based on the ethics, values, and principles of a family I was working with turned out to be helpful, and how I found myself returning to the anchoring metaphor time and time again whenever conversations became difficult or stuck. More on that later. Point 5, we tell fewer and fewer stories in our everyday lives. Han argues that telling our stories is in decline because communication in the contemporary digital world takes the form of information exchange. Han contends that the loss of empathy in the age of the smartphone makes clear that technology is not a medium for telling stories. Typing and swiping are not narrative gestures. Han believes that our lives governed by the smartphone allows only for the accelerated information or exchange of information, which is interesting because in my role as a supervisor, I'm hearing more and more that therapy is increasingly becoming a place for information dumping rather than a site of narrating. And when therapists invite a narrating, there is pushback, which is a result of, I believe, that we are inviting folks into something where they experience themselves as de-skilled, which leads me to our last point. Point 6, we increasingly lack the patience for attentive listening and even the patience for narrative. Because the smartphone allows only for the accelerated exchange of information, Han contends that we are increasingly losing our ability for deep listening and even for the patience of narrative. That the information society we live in is so powerful that storytelling or the narrative community is unable to transform it in any meaningful way, that we are now in a society absent of meaning or orientation. Important points. And those are the main points of his thesis in the Crisis of Narration, and there'll be others. Over the next several weeks, I'm going to be doing a deeper dive into the chapters and his ideas, and hopefully present some ideas on how we, as narrative therapists, might meet these challenges for our contemporary time. Some of his ideas you might disagree with, but I do think he is pointing to something significant and challenges narrative therapy and therapists to be reflecting on. I hope you will follow along. If you made it this far, please like or subscribe to my YouTube channel to be notified when any new videos are released. And as always, thanks for watching. Peace.